2023 has been a year filled with high-quality releases, a lot of arguably genre-defining games. Some stinkers, but generally it's been just good stuff back to back. And my favorite game of the year, and potentially of all time, is one that I've waited over 10 years for. Pikmin is an incredibly important series to me, and I'm happy to report that 4 is everything I could have wanted it to be. The problem is, if that I were to just talk about the game in a whole, I wouldn't really know where to start. I have a lot of thoughts and opinions, and I don't think I have the chops to connect it all and keep things so cohesive from a writing perspective. So, instead of talking about the game as a whole, I'd like to focus on the most contentious aspect of the game: the difficulty. A lot of people have talked about how Pikmin 4 is too easy and doesn't provide enough challenge to the player. So let's investigate that. Is the game too easy? And more importantly, is that a bad thing? Now, to start talking about difficulty, I actually have to talk about the game's most central mechanic. So let's talk about Ochi. Ochi is arguably Pikmin 4's largest shakeup from the previous games. He is your companion dog creature that helps you throughout the game in almost every way. He makes navigation easier, combat easier, collecting easier, and he's got all the capabilities of a secondary captain, so he can help your Dandori as well. As a whole, he's in many ways what the game is centered around. A lot of the especially newer enemies are built with Ochi's capabilities in mind. He also allows for some older, arguably too challenging enemies to be reintroduced because of the ways he minimizes squad management. Ochi has ended up pretty divisive among fans. He's not necessarily a controversial addition. Everyone seems to love him, but I think a lot of the ire I've seen towards the game is pointed towards Ochi more than other things, largely because of how he ends up entrenched in the whole of the game. He brings a lot of positives. Riding around on him is fun, charging enemies is fun. He's a nice guy, and I think he blends into the gameplay loop pretty well. On the negative end though, if you haven't gathered already from what I've been saying, he makes things a lot easier. I'll say primarily combat is where Ochi is said to really overstep the lines of balance, and there are two big ways as to how he does this. The first is just how powerful his charge attack is against almost everything in the game. Once you've upgraded it a bit and have a good army on your back, one charge is enough to kill almost every enemy before their stun wears off. This generally will eliminate any real threat of most enemies since they don't even really get to attack. There are ways that the game tries to avoid making this the sole method of engaging with enemies. Things like flying enemies or bosses that are actually designed around Ochi's charge, so landing the charge becomes where the challenge is. There are also bulkier enemies that don't get as affected by a single charge, or things that come in groups so you might get caught stranded while waiting for the cooldown. I'm of two minds about this as an issue. On one hand, I don't really think it's that big of a deal. Pikmin as a series has always had very simple combat, and the addition of a powerful tool like this will generally always warp the optimization to be around it. The first game didn't have anything major, but the enemies were shallow in it, and so you didn't really need to find any exploits. In 2, it was purple Pikmin and the bitter spray that would let you pretty much skip combat, and the third game is pretty much the story as the first game, except it's all just easier. Ochi's charge attack in 4 is more exploitative than 2's purple Pikmin. This is because of how low investment it is and its low risk. In 2, while purples were absurdly powerful, they were still just as frail as other Pikmin, and they were a bit harder to obtain because you only had the candy pop buds. Bitter Spray was another case of something that was way above the power curve, but it did require you to kind of grind the flowers and berries and generate some stockpile ahead of time. Ochi's rush attack doesn't really have these conditionals. You just need to save a little bit of time to get it ready, and then you hit it. The punishment for whiffing is not that high, and the cost to try again is equally low. I'd agree that of anything the series has seen, the rush attack is by far the most powerful tool, but I don't think it's that unreasonable. Most enemies throughout the game's history die in a comparable amount of time if you were to just throw Pikmin at them from behind, or even from the front. It also just feels good to do. However, I think the second aspect is where he makes the game actually a lot easier. This is how Ochi will generally eliminate the need to manage your squad, primarily due to the fact that while riding him, all of your Pikmin stick to your back. This means that you have the tightest possible control over where your Pikmin are at all times. A lot of the challenge in the series in general comes from not having this control, where sometimes your Pikmin will end up caught up in the crossfire and you're trying to herd cats while avoiding attacks, and it leads to a lot of accidental deaths. Ochi eliminating this objectively makes the game easier, which isn't inherently a bad thing, mind you. A lot of people do not enjoy when their Pikmin die. Miyamoto even cited that he thinks the risk of losing Pikmin had hurt the series' popularity in the past. And secondarily, if it doesn't just feel bad to lose Pikmin in general, it feels even worse to lose them to things that are, at first glance, out of your control. Oh, that idiot ran too close to the Bulborb. Oh, they didn't get away from the bomb rock. Of course, if you're a bit more seasoned, a bit of a veteran of the Pikmin series, you'll be a lot better at intentionally avoiding these circumstances, but that doesn't eliminate the annoyance that is felt when you lose a couple dozen because their AI put them in danger's path. I think the value of eliminating those frustrating experiences is worth more than the challenges that squad management brings, especially for newer players. It's also just kind of nice and cute to see them all on his back. To recap, I think there is no doubting how Ochi has made the game easier. However, the crutches that he offers and the gameplay loop he provides are more beneficial than detrimental to the game, even if that sacrifices challenge. I think if you wanted to make Pikmin 4 harder, hitting Ochi isn't a fun way to do it, unless there were some minor tweaks. Shift the game more around him instead, as he's very fun to utilize in the core systems and was a fantastic addition. Which now leads me to talk about difficulty as a whole. To start, I'll be entirely blunt. Pikmin 4 is an easy game. If you just wish to complete the game front to back and don't care about challenging yourself intentionally, it's going to be a generally stress-free experience. There are moments that can test your capabilities, but those are generally reserved for either optional content or the late game content. However, I think a lot of Pikmin fans, when saying this, forget some key things to actually make this a constructive conversation. The first of which being, if you are not accustomed to or seasoned with Pikmin's raw gameplay, it can be seriously confusing or like a fish out of water scenario. I've watched a lot of people play Pikmin 4 as their first game in the series, and they were really feeling some pushback from the game in a way that I think is healthy. It's not going to be this immense challenge even in that case, but the team definitely knew they needed to help ease in a new generation and make this a proper jumping in point. And the second is more of a question. And it feels obvious, but in my research, I feel like it actually needs to be asked. What makes a Pikmin game difficult? So, I think it's generally handled in one of two ways. Either a Pikmin game causes challenge by having time be a very important resource. That's how 1 and 3 handle it. Pikmin being lost directly correlates to time lost, which could lead to one less ship part for the day, or maybe just your rooting will be what makes the difference. The other is just raw, unbridled aggression towards the player. That's Pikmin 2.
Holy shit!
I need to go on record by saying that I love Pikmin 2. It is a competitor for my favorite game ever made, and I enjoy and admire all of its blemishes. But the game's bullshit. It doesn't play fair. The way that it challenges you, or wants to challenge you, is through the amount of times it can wipe your squad. This is because time doesn't matter in the game, so the only real way for it to impact the player is to kill all your guys. This is because if it manages to kill all your guys, you either have to reset or spend a long time regenerating your squad. Because in Pikmin, challenge comes from time lost. So which of these methods does Pikmin 4 take on? Well, it doesn't really lean into either of them. Where Pikmin 4 tries to apply pressure to the player is generally in smaller doses. Like the second game, there's no time limit in 4, so time loss in a grand sense doesn't mean anything to the player. To compensate for this, the game features quite a few of these timed challenges in the form of either a Dandori challenge or a Dandori battle. The challenges task you to collect everything on a designed level within the time limit, and the battles are a tug-of-war push and pull between you and the AI to collect either more stuff or higher value stuff. These are where I think Pikmin 4 does its best to actually try and cause some real resistance to the player, and I think it's generally pretty successful. They tend to have some pretty genuinely great level design and enemy placements that aren't going to be the most challenging thing you've ever seen, but each time you fight it takes time, and Pikmin Lost means one less gold nugget at a time, or one more trip back and forth for an item. They're very reminiscent of Pikmin 3's challenge mode, which was equally well done. Similarly, there's a stretch of challenges that are available to the player in the latter half of the game that offers something that's genuinely hard. It warrants some real planning and actual execution in proper Dandori. They're fantastic, and I don't want to say too much about them because of spoilers, but I would personally love to see DLC for the game that's just more of that. In fact, the latter half of the game as a whole is where they tried to offer up some more challenging gameplay. It's never too intense, but there's definitely a bit of a spike compared to the earlier elements. And that's kind of where the difficulty in Pikmin 4 ends. The rest of the game, as I've said many times now, is generally quite easy. But if you remember from that title there and my introduction, I question if that's a bad thing. I think something important that's lost here is the idea of intent. What is Pikmin 4 trying to do? I think Pikmin 4 is a game that's trying to do a lot of things, but most importantly, it is trying to serve as an entry point in the franchise for people. Its other main goal is to get the player invested in its world operations. It wants to make you feel like you're exploring a world that's much larger than you. It wants you to take interest in the scenery, engage in the environment, and have a fun time observing the inhabitants. It's almost like it's trying to take you on a tour of what it has to offer. The world of Pikmin 4 is one that's generally intimate with veterans of the series, but it offers just enough new concepts and showcases environments that hadn't really been investigated previously in the franchise, like the interior of a home or an aquarium. I also can't forget the shift in camera angle, adopting more of an over-the-shoulder look at the world instead of a top-down RTS view. This helps a lot with the immersion, and bringing you closer to the ground lets the game really make the large things, whether it be enemies or objects, feel large compared to the player. It also offers the best Piclopedia the series has ever had, providing the classic detailed notes on every creature, but also the addition of basically a training mode for everything as well. I spent hours in Pikmin 2's Piclopedia as a kid growing up, and seeing the way it's presented in 4 is kind of a dream come true. I love it, and I think it does so much for the nerd in me that loves learning about and interacting with these creatures. Pikmin as a series has always had strong atmosphere. In fact, that's one of its most lasting pieces that I've really grown to appreciate as I've grown older, but Pikmin 4 really takes it a step further with everything I've described. When it's firing on all cylinders to get you immersed, it's a really engaging terrarium of nature to explore. Places like the Serene Shores have some really spectacular ambiance, and the underwater segments especially feel extra fleshed out. It feels like a lot of what Pikmin 4 has accomplished with the visual and audio design is what the series has always aimed to do. Caves are better than ever visually, the surface worlds are exciting even if a little bit samey, and the nature of it all is special. The raw aesthetics of Pikmin 4's world only take it so far though. The other big element are the feelings provided to the player when they see the world tick and move like a machine. This is primarily experienced when you've got squads of Pikmin all working at once doing their own things. I think these two elements are kind of divided in the game. The surface is more interested in getting the player invested in the visual splendor, while the caves and challenges want the player to enjoy the industry of nature, watching all the Pikmin like an ant colony take down the creatures and deliver things back. They clearly care a lot about this given the importance placed consistently upon Dandori, and proper Dandori. Watching the Dandori go just feels good, and I am repeating this over and over because that feeling is what Pikmin 4 is trying to introduce to players. As I've said earlier, Nintendo very obviously wanted this to be an introduction of the series. They knew that they needed to make Pikmin 4 a game that you can kinda just start the franchise with, so that is why they focused on making these moment-to-moment interactions feel good and interesting, even to people who are completely blind. My end point in this is that Pikmin 4 is too easy, but it's by design, and that's not a bad thing. The game has done astoundingly well for itself, and even as a veteran of the series, if I rarely ever felt challenged, I was still getting swept up in the magic it was providing. I was consistently impressed with the design of the caves, the way they kept putting new folds into the industrial pipelines, and the way the environments visually felt so expansive. In the future, when I play the game a dozen more times, I'll probably be doing so with some difficulty mods, but for what Pikmin 4 was attempting to do, its current state is more than fine.